802 cable hat pattern knit along. We've gone ahead and talked about the pattern, and you've picked up your 802 cable hat pattern on Ravelry. And then we've talked about needles, the cable needle that you'll need, and whether you're going to use a circular needle or a set of 5 double-pointed needles, or a set of 4 double-pointed needles if that is your preference. And now we're ready to move on to and you've knitted up some swatches, checked your gauge, and you're ready to begin. So now we are set to go. So now what we are going to do is cast on. Now, you remember when we were talking about needles, I said those of you who are circular needle fans, go right ahead and knit with your circular needles, and don't worry about what I tell you about the double pointed needles if that is your preference. Casting on, I'm going to say something much the same, which is that I tend to cast on with the long tail method. However, there are many different methods of casting on, and those of you who are experienced knitters may have your own preferences, especially for a cast on that's stretchy. You can do an Italian cast on or a daisy chain cast on. For those of you who are new knitters, you also were probably taught one cast on, and that's what you're going to stick with, and it may or may not be this long tail cast on. So you're going to select a stretchy cast on, and if you're a new knitter and just know one way, or if like me, you've been using the long tail cast on for, over 50 years, then here is my suggestion for you. My suggestion is to get a straight needle of a couple sizes larger than your normal knitting, unless you know that you normally cast on in a very loose fashion. Most of us cast on in a fairly tight fashion, and so what we can do to make sure that that is nice and stretchy around the edge of the hat is to cast on using a needle that's a bit larger than we'll be working with. Here we're going to cast on 80 stitches, so we want to leave a good long tail for those of you doing the long tail method, and we're just going to go ahead and cast on 80 stitches on a needle that's bigger than what we're going to be knitting with, so that you can make sure that there's lots and lots of stretch. Right, so you have taken a needle that's slightly bigger, a size or two bigger, depending on how tightly you tend to cast on, than the needle you'll be working with, and you have cast on 80 stitches. Again, by whatever method works for you, that is a really nice stretchy cast on, or like me, using this cheater's method of using a couple size larger needle to make sure you've got all the space you need. I had just a couple inches left on my cast on, which is perfect, and I'm not going to tell you whether that's because I have 50 some odd years of knitting experience or whether I was just lucky this time, but sometimes it takes a few different rounds of casting on to make sure that you just have a little bit of enough yarn left at the beginning to sew in once you are all done. Now comes the transition from your cast on needle to the needles you will be knitting with. If you are knitting with a circular needle, just go ahead and knit off of your cast on needle in your normal fashion until you have all of the needles on your circular needle, and then join it into a loop, being absolutely certain not to twist that loop. That is, of course, always the trick, whether you're using double pointed needles or a circular needle. For the rest of us using double pointed needles, and for those of you who are going to be brave and try this set of 5 needles, 4 to have your work divided on and another to knit with, you've cast on 80 stitches. So what you're going to do is begin your knit 1, purl 1, ribbing, and just knit and purl 20 stitches onto each needle. So we'll knit, purl 20 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You'll note that I knit in the continental method with the yarn on my left hand. 12, knit, purl 13, 14, knit, purl 15, 16, knit, purl 17, 18, knit, purl 19, 20. So we've got 20 stitches on our first double pointed needle. We let that hang there. We pick up the next double pointed needle and we repeat 20 stitches. Knit 1, purl 1. You'll also note that only when I'm on my cast on row with the long tail method, it's often easier to do what's called knitting through the back loop in order to get those stitches off just on the very first row. That is that I go into the stitch, let's see if you can see that better, in the middle of the stitch rather than parallel to the needle. Okay, I am on my 4th needle now, and you can see there's 20 stitches on each of these needles, and they're just hanging while I finish up the last one here. So let's see, we're up to 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. So now the needle that I cast on, I can just put that aside. I won't need that again for the entire project. What do you do if you don't have another needle laying around? If you read my instructions and it didn't say you needed an extra big needle, take 2 needles of your double pointed needles and hold them parallel together and just cast on over that and then gently pull the extra one out. So now you've got 20 stitches on each of these needles. You're going to put them around, I would say in a circle, but you know what? It's a square. So you are going to put them around in a square, and what you're going to do is make sure that the cast on edge, the bottom, is facing in the same direction. I like to put it to the inside to make sure that your stitches are not twisted. So make sure that you haven't created a Mobius by twisting the loop. So make sure that all of your stitches are facing in the same direction, in this case to the inside of the square. That means you don't have a twist in your hat that is going to make it impossible to put it on your head. So now you ignore your little tail from casting on, put that aside. You take your yarn from the ball, and that's at the end of this last needle, and you go to the first stitch on the first needle, and you go ahead and just knit through that stitch and pull it good and snug, and then purl the next one and knit the next one. And now you have completed your square. Your square is now complete. You have the yarn divided on your 4 needles, and you're going to go ahead and continue to knit 1, purl 1 in ribbing for about 2.5 inches. That is a wide rib, or a tall rib rather, for this particular hat. But with this particular hat, one of the things is that we don't, we're only gonna add 4 stitches at the end of the ribbing before going into our pattern. So you're relying on that nice deep ribbing to hold it on your head. It also does not have a turned up cuff. If you want a turned up cuff, you're going to have to knit 2.5 inches, do a turning row, and then knit 1, purl 1, another 2.5 inches. The reason for that is you can't turn up the ribbing on this hat pattern as it is, or you will obscure the numeral 2 out of our 802 cable if you turn the cuff of the hat up. So if you like or prefer a turned up cuff, you're going to do 2.5 inches of ribbing, do a turning row, and do another 2.5 inches of ribbing so that your pattern starts here where it emerges from the ribbing. However, with this design and the 2.5 inches of ribbing, I've had no problem with this hat stretching out. It stays nice and comfortably on the head without turning up that extra layer of cuff on it. So you can go ahead and knit up your ribbing, knit one, purl one, until you have 2.5 inches of ribbing on your needles.